Okay, digital image pre-processing is what we're talking about today. And I'm going to be drawing a parallel between this and putting on makeup. And I know nothing about putting on makeup, so y'all please help me with this fascinating science. I watched maybe 2 or 3 YouTube videos, and I realized, oh my goodness, this is a whole world that I know nothing about. It was some next level stuff that I was not prepared for at all. But some people do some pretty extreme stuff, so I won't try to veer away from the more extreme things, but we will talk a little bit about some extreme things, with the purposes of helping us understand what pre-processing is. So the major metaphor of the day is that we want pretty pictures, right? And so we want to be able to take pretty pictures. That's the reason why we put on makeup, is to look a little bit more pretty or whatever. That's what we're doing when we apply these pre-processing algorithms to our x-ray pictures, is we're making them more pretty, easier to look at. Post-processing will also define, and those are largely the things that we have some control over. So pre-processing is stuff that the computer does, post-processing stuff that we do. We'll talk about corrections made to establish field uniformity. So we'll define what field uniformity is. We'll explain noise reduction for things like dexal dropout, so we'll have to define what a dexal is. We'll have a lot of definitions of terms today. And we'll need to define image analysis, to talk about partition pattern recognition and exposure field recognition. These are real problems. I know some of this sounds kind of super abstract and just kind of out there and stuff that you never ever have to worry about, but I'll tell you, I was out at Finn on Friday helping Julianne with a exposure field recognition error, and we fixed that, and it's a way to save patients dose. If you understand just kind of the basics of what the computer's doing, you can avoid repeats, which is a bonus in my world. We'll talk about how we construct the image histogram, and that's where we're going to burn a lot of time in the textbook and making sure that we're anchored in what the textbook's talking about. We'll talk about the values or volumes of interest and the way that those are defined. We'll talk about superimposing grayscale curves in order to kind of change the way the computer looks at it to the way the human eye looks at things, particularly as it relates to contrast. And finally, we'll talk about the errors that can result from all of these operations and ways to correct them. So pre-processing. I'm going to say that pre-processing is like all the work that we have to do to make our face in the morning, right? Or imagine that we're going to be in a movie, right? Or I guess another thing would be like getting married. Like I remember, for example, when my wife was bridesmaid in my sister's wedding, right? My wife's not super into makeup or anything like that, but she went to some kind of makeup thing that required like 4 hours, right? And I was like, what on earth are they doing, right? I have no clue what could take 4 hours. But then I saw her, right, at the wedding, and it was amazing. The transformation was really remarkable. I don't know. She looked like almost a different person. Like I almost didn't recognize her. So there had been a great deal of processing that had occurred prior to her showing up at the wedding. She would probably kill me if she heard me talking about this. So y'all don't tell her that this is on YouTube now. I'll try not to mention any names. The exact same thing is happening from the computer's point of view prior to its displaying our X-ray or portal film images. It's applying a whole lot of stuff to these pictures, and the processes that it applies to the pictures are remarkably similar to the processes that we apply when we do this kind of heavy makeup type stuff, right? So looking at this eye makeup that's being done here on the right, there's got to be some kind of uniformity applied across the image. We're going to make the surface fairly uniform. Then we're going to add layers of contrast to it, right? Based on what we would expect with this given makeup style, right? So we have some idea of what we want to see at the end. Like, for example, we want, I don't know, who has nice makeup? Someone tell me a name for someone who has great makeup. Who's someone whose makeup you like? Morphe. Okay. Morphe's got, is this a girl?
It's just a makeup brand.
Okay, it's a makeup brand. So imagine the Morphe models, thank you, right? They have an end goal. They've got like a photo shoot that they've done of this is what this makeup should result in, right? Is like, let's say Morphe model A. This is the model A that we would hope to see. If you apply the makeup in these steps, it should wind up looking like this, right? So that's exactly what the computer is doing. It has these algorithms, right, that it applies to the raw image data, just kind of the raw data as it is, to get rid of physical flaws in image acquisition, right? To cover up that unwanted blemish, to get rid of, to highlight the eyes, for example, to make the face appear more attractive or what have you. I don't really know, but the purpose with the X-ray thing is to largely correct for errors that were there in the process, so blemishes, and to highlight areas of interest. Okay? And so the important thing here is that these are computerized operations that must be executed on the raw image data. So computerized operations executed on the raw image data, that's what we're going to call pre-processing. Post-processing, I'm going to compare to this woman here, right, who she's already got her face on for the day, and she's getting ready for the guests are coming for the dinner party, and she touches up, you know, her lipstick. These are the lipstick type things, the lipstick touch-up type stuff that needs to happen, right? So we've got the image, it's looking pretty, all the pre-processing stuff has been done. Post-processing are those things that are now technologist or therapist operations that are done just after the pre-processing. So there's that additional little brush up that might be needed to be done very quick, not the in-depth stuff that occurred with pre-processing. So these are available to the user in addition to the default pre-processing stuff, and it's ways that we can correct for the picture for our own way of viewing things, right? It should be pointed out, though, that almost everything that we can do in post-processing is stuff that the computer does during pre-processing. So the operations are the same, it's just who's doing it. Pre-processing, it's the computer, it's much more in-depth. Post-processing, it's the user, and it's much quicker. Or it's not as in-depth, I should say. These post-processing operations, these kind of lipstick-type operations, are a major advantage of digital imaging as compared to film. When we were shooting film, we could not do this stuff. We could not change contrast. The contrast was whatever you got. Whatever you got on your picture, that's the contrast you got. If you didn't like it, if it was too dark or too light, guess what? You had to hold it up to a hot box. It was this light bulb that was really intense. You would step on the light bulb and it would burn through the film so that you could maybe see what you were trying to see up against this very bright light, right? So that was as close as we could get to changing anything about the image. But now with digital, we can window and level all day long. We can apply measurements. We can even change the lookup table that's being used to process the information. But the major ones that we mess around with are brightness and contrast adjustments. So we will call those post-processing. So windowing, window width and window level, that's post-processing. Okay, field uniformity, right? I tried to find as inoffensive a picture as possible for what we're talking about with this. But this is close to me in high school. So this is one of the reasons I'm super uncomfortable talking about makeup with y'all today. I had horrible acne in high school, right? Horrible. So when I think about what field uniformity is, I think about those types of blemishes that I had on my face at that time. Imagine if the same kinds of things were happening on your X-ray picture. You would want to correct for that prior to applying any kind of makeup, right? So before I put any kind of lipstick, on this guy, for example, I've got to cover up a whole lot of stuff or the lipstick's not going to make any sense. It's actually going to wind up highlighting the blemishes, right? So an ideal image, the image receptor would be completely uniform. There would be no changes across the entire surface of the image receptor. But that's simply not the case. It doesn't matter if we're talking about a portal imaging system, a DR system, a computed radiography system. Every single one of these image receptors have slight imperfections in them. Think about them as being like pimples, right? The main one that we are most concerned with is Dexel dropout, okay? Dexel, you might be wondering, what is a Dexel? Well, it's the detector element, right? It is kind of the physical form of the pixel. This detector element is what translates the remnant beam into the computer and creates the pixels that we have on our image. So there's a whole lot of these things, a lot of little tiny detector elements on the image receptor. And if for whatever reason one of them falls out of order, then we have a blemish there. We have a way that the field is not uniform. There's like a pimple on the image receptor now. So there can be all sorts of faults that result in that blemish. The main three are dark noise, right? And this is accumulated background radiation on a computed radiography phosphor plate. So believe it or not, the CR cassettes are actually more susceptible to background radiation than film cassettes were. So you might be wondering, well, how come we don't keep our CR cassettes in a lead-lined container like we used to with film? That's a great question. But the answer is we have this field uniformity algorithm that we can apply. So we just assume there's going to be background radiation on our CR cassettes, and the computer gets rid of the background radiation. It expects the background radiation to be there, and we call that dark noise. It's there from background radiation. There's dark current, and this is weird. This would be the case with portal imaging and with direct radiography systems. Dark current is current flowing through the system when no exposure is taking place, right? So we have to have these Dexels activated on our DR systems. There has to be some electricity flowing through them. And anytime you have electricity flowing through this complex array of detector elements, inevitably some current will flow from detector element to detector element, and it might receive that current as though it were X-ray transmission. It wasn't an X-ray transmission, it was just electricity, right? And we will call that dark current. So again, that could also create a blemish or like a pimple on the image. The final thing, and the one that I've said is probably the most significant, is Dexel dropout. If for any reason a portion of the detector goes dead, right? So with a DR system or with a portal imaging system, a physical part of one of these little tiny transistors has fallen out. It is no longer receiving any information at all, right? We will call that Dexel dropout. On a CR system, if there's a scratch on the phosphor plate, or if there's some kind of chemical change in the phosphor to where it's no longer receiving information, we'll call that Dexel dropout as well. This is different from having a dead pixel on your monitor screen. Having a dead pixel on your monitor, it's always going to show up in the same place on your monitor, right? It's your monitor just has a dead pixel. It doesn't matter if you're looking at the internet or if you're looking at an X-ray, that same pixel is dropped out of your monitor, right? So the monitor needs to be recalibrated or replaced. This is something that's happening at the image receptor plate. It's a similar thing, but the detector element itself has dropped out, right? So we would only see it when we're imaging in this certain way, or with this one CR plate. The way that the computer corrects for this, I'm going to toggle over here real quick to our reading, is it applies a test like this. Before anything is done with the image, it measures this background field of the CR plate or the DR plate. Sometimes this has to be done by the physicist. Sometimes it is done prior to any image exposure, right? But it has these 5 quadrants that it's going to test. It's very interested in these 5 quadrants. They will always be the same. It'll always look like a 5 on the dice, right? Because it's looking at the upper corner, both upper corners, both lower corners, and the middle, right? And it's averaging between those. You can see there's different numbers given for the darkness in these different corners, right? And it's saying between these different areas, kind of distributed across the image receptor, there's this amount of variance. So let's just average it all together, right? Now we have something that's fairly uniform. So that's what we're talking about when we talk about these flat field uniformity corrections. And I don't know, the makeup parallel that I've got is like one of these facial type things, right? Or like for me in high school, it was those awful acne medicines, right? That I had to put on my pimples or whatever to make them go away. So anything to get the oil or whatever off of your skin, that's like a flat field uniformity correction. So we want to get rid of all the pimples, right? All those noisy things, whether it's the dark noise or the dark current, dark noise, or the Dexel dropout. We have a way of applying these algorithms to flatten that out, to get rid of those imperfections. So what it's going to do is, using that algorithm I was just showing you, that like 5-sided dice thing, it's just going to look between them. It's going to say they should all be the same number, ideally. So how can I either offset the gain or the electronic response to make those all the same? So gain is just almost like feedback in the system. It's an inappropriate spike in the noise, right? It's a difference in the signal. I don't know if you've ever been listening to a public speaker, and like the way that they are holding the microphone or something, it's really making the P's pop. Like every time they say a P word like Pepsi, right, it is literally causing it's about to blow out the speakers, right? There's something about the way that they're pronouncing that P sound that is causing this additional gain in the system, right? That's what we're talking about. Is the same thing could be happening with our X-rays, where there's some place where there's too much darkness, it's too dense, and it's like popping the system, right? So we need to turn down the gain. It does not need to be that dark, right? And the computer knows how to do that. Another example would be variations in the Dexel sensitivity itself. So some Dexels, these are little tiny electronic components. Some of them are made better than others, right? On any given array of an image receptor, some Dexels are good and some of them are not so good. Some of them receive a lot of information, some of them are kind of lazy, right? So we have to figure out a way to kind of go through there, and as we're scanning each Dexel, did this one really receive just this amount or did it actually receive more? Same thing can happen with the CR system, but we call it a variation in the scintillator thickness. So we haven't yet gotten into the way that CR cassettes work. But inside of a CR cassette, a computed radiography cassette, there is a thin photostimulable phosphor plate. It's like a matrix or actual film of tiny, tiny crystals, right? And those crystals respond to light. They emit their signal when we scan them with the laser. If they vary in thickness, if as we were creating that CR image receptor, we poured on a little bit more crystals in this area and a little bit less here, those different areas are going to be different levels of receptivity. It's almost like the thick area is the good part and the thin area is the part where there's the pimple. And we can also have variations with the light guide itself. So the way that this CR system works is once you have the remnant, the image on the photostimulable phosphor plate, it's scanned with a laser. if there's any problems with the laser, if like there's a funny part of the laser where the laser signal is less powerful, like in this upper right-hand corner or something, that could also cause this variation. So the computer needs to correct for that. And again, the major metaphor I've said that for these flat field uniformity corrections is just like with a facial or something like that, we want to correct for any of these blemishes. Okay, that is different from noise reduction. These transformations blow my mind. Like, I don't know how this works. It's magic to me. But those are like two different people to me, right? Particularly like Catwoman in the upper right-hand corner. Like, the fact that we have to go from like this place to the other is fascinating to me. And I can see why people get hooked on these like weird YouTube makeup videos and stuff. But her thoughts, the reason she's doing this are the same reasons why the computer scientists came up with these noise reduction algorithms, right? They've recognized that to actually get rid of the noise, we have to be thinking about what's the end product going to look like, right? Because some of the transformations we're going to go through are going to look really weird, right? So the same thing is happening here with preprocessing in terms of reducing the Dexel dropout. So Dexels can drop out completely. They can go completely dead, right? And so, for example, I could think about this as being like one of the pits that I have from like a really bad pimple that I had when I was 16, right? So if you had a really bad pimple and you didn't listen to the doctor and you popped it like every week or something, I'm not trying to be too gross, but eventually that area is going to have a scar on it, right? Same thing could happen on this image receptor. After enough time of the image receptor not receiving information or shorting out or getting too much dark current at that spot, eventually the Dexel could just say, I'm done, I'm out, right? I'm permanently out of commission. So this malfunctioning Dexel winds up being a dead spot on our picture. And so I'm not trying to pick on this individual here, but I don't know, I can't really tell from the image. But let's say that there's a portion of her skin where there's a scar, right, from a pimple or something like that. What she would need to do in the world of X-ray is apply a kerneling filter to that, right? This is a software filter, right? But what kerneling does is it averages the entire area. So say there's a dead spot right here on the skin. It can't just correct for the dead spot. It can't just cover the dead spot up with like glue or something, I don't know. It needs to average everything around the dead spot. Now, y'all who know something about makeup, is this totally crazy, or is this kind of how this stuff works? Because what I'm seeing in terms of her transformation is she's leveled out the playing field. So she's created this uniform field, and now she's applying some makeup, maybe in this lower left-hand corner, that's allowing for the places that are a little bit too light, she's put on a little bit more makeup, and the places that are dark, she's just kind of left alone, right? That's what's happening in here. And so I actually like the example he has in the book of how kerneling works. Let me find that real quick. So in our text, let me get out of here. Yeah, I think it's 478. He talks about this kerneling operation here. And what he says is, there's just some normal wear and tear that happens with our image receptors. And to correct for that normal wear and tear, we are going to average the areas around it. So we can actually reverse, knowing that black should be black and white should be white, we can flip those around to see, okay, did it change that one area? If it didn't change that one area when I toggle the colors, then I know that area needs to be corrected, right? I'll leave it at that. The main takeaway here for us is that this is a submatrix, meaning it's a software filter. When you see the word submatrix, don't freak out. But it creates a separate matrix. There is actually a picture of what this separate matrix looks like in the textbook. And it pulls those numbers out to that submatrix, to that separate matrix, and it averages and fills in what's missing. It averages or fills in what's missing. Okay. The final thing, and we're gonna spend quite a bit of time on this, is image analysis, and this is where we're gonna burn quite a bit of time. Because this is clearly where the makeup goes next level as far as I can tell. Like I was tracking with the whole makeup argument when we're talking about covering up pimples or whatever. But this kind of stuff, where we've actually mapped out on the face what areas should be highlighted, what areas shouldn't be, that kind of stuff is pretty next level to me. The computer's doing a very similar thing when it does what's called histogram analysis. So we're going to use this image here on the right to help us understand these more complicated operations. But we have to think about this as analyzing every single component of the image data, of this raw data, prior to the manipulation. So knowing, okay, I'm looking at a chest, for example, chest x-ray, and the computer says, okay, this is what I expect to see. This is what I think the user wants, right? This is, what was the name of the makeup company again? Morphe Model A, right? They don't want the B, they want the A, right? And here's what I need to do to get to this A output, right? So it's going to think about this stuff or start to partition this stuff out there prior to any kind of manipulation changing things. So this is called partition pattern recognition or segmentation. So in a similar regard, where this makeup program has said divide the human face into these segments, the same thing the computer is doing with our x-ray images. It's dividing them into segments. And it's saying I need to apply this filter to this area and this other filter, this other brush to this other area, right? There's two main things that we are trying to accomplish with this, right? And that's to get rid of these two different types of noise. One of them is density outside of the collimated field. Density outside of the collimated field. We have to be able to recognize what was actually the picture and what wasn't the picture. What was just getting information that actually wasn't the information that we needed. And then we also, like we said with the flat fielding, we need to be able to eliminate the background radiation. There is a third thing that it's not really quite noise, but it is something that falls underneath the noise category. I'll call it an artifact. But sometimes we want artifacts there, right? An example of that would be barium. I want the barium to be, for example, in the large bowel. But if I don't tell the machine I wanted barium to be on this picture, it's going to throw the whole thing off. So that's not technically noise, but it could change things, right? Something to consider. One way to think about that, the barium, I guess, if we're going to continue with the makeup analogy, is like with the, so I want Morphe Model A. That's what I'm shooting for with this data, right? I want to make the transformations that make this person look like this. But let's say they have a tattoo of a tear on their left eye, right? That changes things considerably, right? If there's a tattoo or something going on with this person's face, that would be like the barium. They wanted it there. It's not an artifact in their opinion. That's the way they wanted the tattoo, and they got it on their face, right? But it does kind of change the way I'm thinking about doing their makeup, right? here's what we're talking about. When we form the histogram, right? And I'll go back, I'm going to be referring to the textbook quite a bit from this point on. Each bar here in this shape, in this graph, represents the number of pixels that hold that gray level, right? The number of pixels with that level of receptor exposure. So all the peaks and valleys in this graph represent variations in the anatomic structures. Okay? So the x-axis indicates the receptor exposure, the y-axis indicates the number of pixels for each exposure, and the patterns will vary for each anatomic part. Right? So the analysis that we're talking about consists of identifying landmarks so that only the values of interest are included in the final image. We have to kind of negotiate these peaks and values, figure out what was actually of use to us for diagnosis, and get rid of anything that wasn't useful, right? Now, in general, when we're looking at this is read pretty much from left to right. The left side will be white stuff, right? So the barium or whatever is going to be on the left side. The right side is the black stuff, right? So any area where there's background radiation or the exposure field, direct exposure to the image receptor, that would show up black. Everything between the left and the right is all the various shades of gray. All the various shades of gray. And these values, these pixel count values, are going to be really high. Why? Because they map right onto the bit depth. So however deep the pixels are, however much information the pixels can receive, that's how much information can be represented on the histogram. So they're really large numbers. Okay. I'm going to start referring quite a bit to the textbook. So let me toggle over here. We'll come back to this a priori histogram stuff. Start with this picture right here. It's a great illustration. So what we have on this, if we're thinking back to planning out how to make a pretty picture out of this, we have on the left-hand side where it says S minimum, what would we expect those pixels to be? What colors are they represented on the image? The white stuff, that's correct. So they're represented as minimum. There was minimum amounts of exposure there. So it showed up white, right? The S maximum, we would expect that to be black. So we had a maximum amount of exposure there. It's black. Everything between the S minimum and the S maximum, the computer is defining as a volume of interest. A volume of interest. It's saying this is what the picture consists of. Everything from the minimum to the maximum. We might wonder, well, what is that other spike there to the far right? Well, that's the stuff that's outside of the collimated field. It's that hyper-intensity of something that was exposed to the direct X-ray beam, right? It was not part of the person's body. It was, for example, just the empty space to their left or right-hand side on the chest X-ray, right? All the black here on this picture on the right of the chest X-ray. So we don't need that. I don't need the black outside the patient's body to influence how the anatomy inside the patient's body looks, right? So we have just basically X'd it out of the histogram. We said we're only interested in this little bell curve here in the middle. The stuff outside of that bell curve, outside of the S minimum or the S maximum, not interested, right? What I've just described is what we would call an a priori histogram analysis. We expected the chest x-ray to have roughly this shape. Anything that doesn't have roughly that shape, we're getting rid of, right? So going back to the world of makeup, right? So saying that we just want this model A, right? Anything outside of the model A, like the person's earring color or their dress color or any of these other extraneous things, all I'm thinking about is the face makeup. If it's extraneous to that, I'm not thinking about it, right? I'm just going to do the makeup job. I'm going to call the face my volume of interest. Anything outside of that volume of interest, I'm not considering, right? So that's what the computer's doing. It's saying, I have this expectation of what a chest x-ray should look like. Anything that doesn't look like what I expect a chest x-ray to look like, I'm getting rid of it. So we call that a priori. A priori means it's just that way, right? It's just that way. So it's something the computer just knows. It just knows that all chest x-ray histograms should look like this bell curve, period, right? If I'm doing the makeup for model A, I just know that all the makeup jobs should wind up looking like model A, period. I'm not worried about what color dress or anything that the person's wearing. The thing is, though, we have to tell the computer what we are hoping the thing to look like, right? So I've talked a lot about this model A. The textbook doesn't define it yet in this chapter, but it will eventually. And the thing that I'm talking about when I talk about model A, in the world of X-ray, we would call a lookup table, L-U-T, lookup table. Lookup table. It has a database of histograms, right? So before I ever scanned my film to this pre-processing process, it already knew when I told it I'm looking at a chest x-ray, this is what a chest x-ray should look like. And that this is what a chest x-ray should look like is what we're talking about when we talk about a lookup table. How does it know that? It looks it up in this vast table of histograms and says, okay, this is the model A x-ray, right? So the reason that's important, the reason I'm burning so much time talking about this, is because if I shot a chest x-ray, but I told the computer it was a hand x-ray, that's a problem, right? Because I'm thinking it's going to give me model A, but I just told the computer give me model C. So the same issues would be in effect. All of the contrast is going to be off. The area that it selects for the volume of interest could be off. A number of things will wind up looking funny about that picture. On this illustration here, I like this picture particularly on the far right, because now we have a histogram that looks really funny, right? So in this example, what we've said on the far right, or on the far left, if I read this thing from left to right, on the far left, I've got a funny little bell-shaped curve. That's barium, right? That funny little bell-shaped curve there on this histogram on our right is barium. I do not need to include barium in my picture, right? I'm not interested in barium. It's just going to be purely white, right? I do want to see the barium on the x-ray, but I'm not interested, if you can imagine, if I told the computer that curve there where the barium is at is what I'm interested in, it's just going to kick out a completely white image. I won't be able to say anything except for barium, right? I'm not interested in the barium, so the volume of interest is everything from where the barium drops off to the far right where I see that second spike. Can anyone guess what that third spike. Can anyone guess what that third spike is there on the image? It's background radiation, right? So it's the extremely dark stuff on the image. Again, not interested. So only the values of interest are included in the area that was imaged. And this process of excluding things that were not of interest, we will call exposure field recognition. Okay? This is going back to the textbook. So, so this entire process that we're talking about, we're defining a volume of interest, right? And anything outside of that volume interest, we're excluding, and that is called exposure field recognition. Exposure field recognition. Its volume of interest is talked about on page 481. And exposure field recognition is talked about on the very next page, the top of the next page. But if you can imagine looking at these two pictures, it's the work, and I like these pictures a lot because it actually shows you the white here for the S min, and it shows you the black there for the S max, right? But if we look at that picture above it, right, we've got a white that goes a little bit further out, and we've got a black that goes much past where the S max is defined. So when we determine this is the exposure field, we're getting rid of everything outside of it. Now, we can also be pretty fancy. And this is kind of the next level of histogram analysis. If we do some what's called deep learning or machine learning. So rather than just telling the machine, you have to go off the lookup table, you have to go off the lookup table, you could ask the machine to start to learn things. So it could look at all the previous, like 50 x-rays that you've shot of this type of body part and start to learn based on how you're shooting in the department what should be the volume of interest. So we'll call that neural histogram analysis or deep learning, right? So an example of that would be in this department, they're shooting chest x-rays of babies, right? And like we typically do in the NICU, we include the abdomen on the image, right? Now we all know those babies are really difficult to take pictures of. They're squirmy. It's hard to make sure that we're not contaminating the field. There's a lot of factors there. Some of them are smaller. You might have shot the baby yesterday and they've gained weight in the following days. So things are changing on a day-to-day level with the child, right? So that's what this process is showing. Let's assume that these are the same patient that's being x-rayed 4 different days, right? We get 4 very different histograms out of this, right? In the first one, we got an almost textbook study, but there's this giant honking right marker in the upper right-hand corner. That's going to show up as an added area of whiteness on the image, right? The next day, there's no leads in place, right? All the leads have been removed, and the marker's gone. So that could change the computer a little bit too, and we can see how it changed the histogram. The baby gets gassy, and that actually causes an increased level of density, so there's more darkness on day 3's picture. And day 4 was just a really bad day for that x-ray tech. And they shot pretty much everything from chin to gonads on the baby, including their legs, right? So we can see that's a remarkably different histogram. What neural histogram analysis does is it looks at every single x-ray, let's say the last 50 x-rays, and it corrects for what it's seeing now. So it learns slightly, and it starts to average based on what it's seen in the past. Now, I'm ridiculously simplifying this process. If you're interested in the neural process, one of the best ways to understand it is to look up YouTube videos about how they've trained computers to recognize pictures of cats and dogs, to differentiate between a cat and a dog. And that will help you understand what I'm saying here. They've showed the computer a whole lot of pictures of cats and a whole lot of pictures of dogs, and now the computer can differentiate between the two and isolate them. If you've ever been using any kind of social media app and it targets, that's your friend Roger in the picture, right? Like on Facebook or something, and it already is starting to label that with this person's name, that's deep learning as well. It's seen enough pictures of Roger to know who that is, and that creeps me the hell out. But the same thing can be applied in a much better way to X-ray. But the only reason I belabor the point is because the outcome is exactly the same. I told it this should look like model A. The only thing it did was one additional fancy step to get to model A. It thought about all the different things that need to be fixed, a little bit more detail to correct that volume of interest. So the big thing here, to go back to the textbook, and one of the things that I've underlined here in the textbook, let me see where it's got it here. Bear with me, I'm sorry. So it's this part here. And this is just as restating something I've been saying kind of the whole time. When the radiographer is at the control console selecting the procedure algorithm, so when I tell it chest x-ray, right? This assigns a type of histogram analysis to be used based on the shape the acquired histogram will be expected to have. So again, this is just a fancy way of saying if you shot a chest x-ray, tell the computer you shot a chest x-ray, not a hand x-ray. The reason for that is simple, and I'm going to put it in really extreme terms, okay? So let's say we wanted a nice makeup job, right? But we got this, right? Now this is actually a good makeup job. It's a really creepy makeup job, but someone really spent some time doing this makeup job. Versus, you know, I looked up just wedding makeup. Makeup for your wedding, right? These are clearly two very different styles of makeup application, right? They have the same processes that are in them. There's a flat field recognition, right? We've had to get rid of any kind of impurities on both persons' skins, right? We had to correct for any kind of noise, right? Then we had to think about, we had to analyze their face, right? And we had to apply different brushes to different areas, right? So we had to select a volume of interest and apply different brushes to that volume of interest. The results are remarkably different, right? So that's what we're talking about when we talk about telling the computer what we're thinking about. If you tell it, I want a wedding picture, but you give it the Joker, right? The lookup table is going to actually mess things up, right? If you tell it you want the Joker's makeup to your lookup table and you give it a wedding picture, it's going to mess things up. So be really careful in what you're selecting at the control console. This is also true for radiation therapy. If as you're shooting your portal images, it is defined, I'm expecting to see a portal image for a prostate, right? If it doesn't get a portal image for a prostate, guess what? The histogram's going to be thrown off, and you're going to be really craning to try to see it. And I don't even know how to begin to correct those errors on portal imaging systems. I know how to do it on computer radiography, but not on portals. Well, y'all call it portal imaging, right? What do y'all call it? Okay. All right. Okay. Automatic rescaling. So, automatic rescaling is, if we go back to the picture of the girl where we've analyzed her face and we've said, this area we're going to apply this brush, this area we're going to apply this brush, the eyes we're going to do something different with. Automatic rescaling is doing the exact same thing, and it's the same purpose. The reason why we define those different parts of the person's face is in order to produce contrast, right? We need to have contrast. There needs to be a different amount of contrast between the cheekbones and the eyebrows, and a different amount of contrast between the eyes and the chin, right? All those require different brushes. The same thing is happening when we look at the lookup table from the point of view of contrast, right? So we've done all of these operations to give ourselves a pretty picture. We've defined the volume of interest. We've told it what we want the end picture to look like, right? Now, though, we've got to rescale it to what the human eye perceives as contrast. Because I can't see all these little tiny whites and blacks and all the thousands of grays that the computer can. So I've got to make it pop a little bit more in order for people to be able to see it. And that way of making things pop, if you will, is to apply an H&D curve to it, right? Now this curve may look a little bit familiar. In fact, this curve is the exact same curve that we use to describe certain types of radiation exposure responses, right? It's an S-shaped curve, right? It has a clear beginning and a clear end, right? So this is a threshold nonlinear curve, right? So dredge up your memories of radiation biology, because we're now using that exact same graphic to give us better contrast. So the steeper the curve, the higher the image contrast is the big takeaway with this. If you're given a picture on your registry and they're asking you to look up grayscale and to consider it from the point of view of the H&D curve, or this S-shaped curve, the whole game is contrast. The whole game is contrast. We might ask, how so? So, it is very, 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 very simple. It only has to do with the shape of the curve, right? If the curve is steep, it will be high contrast. If the curve is steep, it will be high contrast. If the curve is a more shallow curve, if the line is longer on that slope, it will be a lower contrast image. So it maps directly onto the grayscale of contrast. And the mnemonic to remember how grayscale of contrast works is long, low, and lots, right? So this may be coming back to haunt some of us who are in image production. But long, low, and lots means that if we have a long slope there, right, it will be low contrast. That will be a long grayscale. It will be low contrast. There will be lots of grays on the image. This is embedded, this grayscale, this rescaling process is embedded in the lookup table, right? So not only will the image that results look different, it might be a Joker versus the wedding picture type thing. If you can imagine, the contrast will be different as well. It's embedded in the lookup table. So, but in general, registries kind of partition this out, and they ask you questions just about the H&D curve as it relates to contrast. Are there questions about it? I've tried to make this as simple as possible. So the way to think about it would be, if I'm doing Halloween makeup, right, and I want your face to look like a skeleton, there's not going to be a lot of flesh tones in that makeup. It's just going to be white or black, right? I'm not doing a lot of other stuff with flesh tones or whatever. I'll do the base, the foundation, and then I'm just doing whites and blacks. That would be that steep curve. There's only whites and blacks on this curve. It's a high contrast makeup job. If I'm doing your wedding makeup, Lord help you. But I am very much interested in what your base flesh tones are, right? And in creating kind of differentiations of all those different flesh tones, right? I have no clue how that works. I think that's how it works. I could be wrong though, right? But I'm interested in lots of low contrast. I'm going to have a gradual change in contrast between cheekbones and the chin area and things like that. Finally, we can have errors with this, right? And the errors are exactly the same process that we've kind of been talking about over and over and over again. But sometimes those errors, the computer just coughs up on its own, right? So if the type of histogram analysis selected doesn't match the actual histogram acquired, it's going to kick out some weird stuff. So this brings me back to last Friday at Finn. What happened then was there was a bug in their system. They're telling it, expect to see a water skull, right? Something about what the computer received was not a water skull. And for the folks in X-ray or in radiation therapy, water skull is basically just a single image of the skull with a slight angle to it, right? It allows us to evaluate the cranium. So it was getting something other than a water skull. And what resulted from that was a picture that just looked like a complete silhouette. It was just a white outline of the patient's body. Now, that's not a useful histogram, right? But knowing what we've learned about today, we can recognize that what the computer did was it defined the wrong part of the histogram as the volume of interest, right? It set the wrong S minimum and it set the wrong S maximum, right? So what resulted was just a white silhouette of the patient's head, right? No amount of adjusting contrast or density was going to fix that, right? No amount of trying to change the Joker's makeup into a wedding day makeup job is going to fix that, right? We need to go all the way back to zero, take off all that Joker makeup, and start with the foundation and rebuild the entire thing. We have to redefine the whole volume of interest. You tracking with me? Have I lost anyone so far on this? So the way to fix it was not to change contrast and brightness. There was no way to window and level and make this pretty again. We had to go back and redefine the lookup table. If you go back and fix the lookup table, you'll get a good picture. Then you can window and level as you need to. You got to change the whole makeup job. You got to redo the foundation up. Okay? So occasionally there are custom histograms that are developed by the manufacturer and they send out a software update and it allows for errors to be corrected, right? Most of us, if you're working on a CR system, sorry, but you're pretty much out of luck. I imagine a lot of those operating systems are just going to be phased out and they'll stop sending those updates, right? For the people in radiation therapy, you will probably continue to get updates. Whenever they do software updates and stuff, that's part of the package that they're sending you. Is they're correcting for errors that have been seen in portal imaging. There can be bugs, right, that just result in a poor image. That's what was happening with Julianne's imaging system. It was nothing that she was doing wrong. She was setting up appropriately for a water skull. She was selecting water skull, and the software had a bug in it, right? No amount of repeating the patient exposure can fix that. Because if you think about it, it's just a software error. X-raying the patient over and over and over again is not going to fix the software error. You might get lucky, right? You might get lucky and eventually it lands on a part of the software that doesn't have a bug in it. But you did not actually fix it with a change in technique. In general, errors are best corrected using windowing and leveling, or making an adjustment to the exposure indicator. That's what I did. I couldn't window and level it back, right? So I wound up messing with that exposure indicator. I'm telling you all that, right, to let you know that if you're out there and you see these types of things come up, please do not x-ray the patient again. Spend a little extra time at the viewing station trying to figure the bug out, right? Because there is a way around the bug. And the final thing I'll put out there, just because this is what I think about when I watch a lot of those makeup things, is I don't know if y'all have seen this guy's reactions to people's makeups. It's pretty amazing. This is Baptist College, so I can't tell you his name or whatever, but I think he's awesome. Y'all are familiar with this guy, right? We've all seen his reaction videos. Okay. Check him out. There's a YouTube link if you're interested. All right, that one's a particularly funny one.